want to acknowledge that I'm coming today from the traditional lands of the Lekwungen speaking people, that currently known as the Songhees and the Esquimalt. And I want to invite that that we all just take a moment of acknowledgement, acknowledging the lands, the ancestors of place where each of us are. And maybe you know them by name and maybe you don't, but just to really take that moment of appreciation for First Peoples. So when I start to appreciate the ancestors, I also feel this call to bless the current generations. Seems so important in these days, and also in this talk about legacy. And then also in our deepest imagination to imagine the future generations flourishing, because ultimately that is legacy, that the future generations, informed by what we do now, will flourish. So I see someone's coming from the Sartlip Nation. Thank you for acknowledging that and sharing that with us. And anybody else who wants to name where they're coming from, feel free to. Chumash, thank you. I always say this acknowledgement sometimes it can be quick, and some of you might say, wow, she's really hanging out there. And I am hanging out here because to me it's a somatic experience. It's actually a bodied experience to offer this kind of appreciation. Say what Mo Nation, I'm sorry, I may not be saying some of them correctly. Okay, and again, yeah, thank you for your presence. So I'm gonna share a slideshow. It's a bit, you know, I'm kind of into slideshows and not into slideshows, but I'm gonna start with one just to help inspire conversation, because what I'd really love is to have a conversation with all of you about ceremony, and especially in these times when ceremony, especially at the end of life, is actually being challenged by all the restrictions. And so I'll share the slideshow, and then hopefully I'll stay and we can have a good conversation at the end. Okay, figure out how to do this. Somehow I've got, let me just see here.
Okay, here you go. You just, for some reason, you stopped being a co-host. You should be able to share now.
Oh, okay.
Okay, just, there you go.
Am I? Okay.
Yes,
Gosh.
yes.
It's like piloting a ship back here. I can't tell you how
I know.
nerve-wracking it is for me sometimes. Okay, here we go.
We all have that problem.
Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, can you see that?
I can see that, yes.
Okay, okay.
So hopefully everybody else can.
Okay. So I have to tell Anna that she changed one word in my presentation and I changed it back. So Anna changed. So she didn't change legacy. It's called legacy. It's more than material matters. And the word matters really matters to me. And so Anna changed it to possessions. And so I had to let it go because it was out there. And but I do want to say that it's more than material matters, and you'll see why in my presentation. Okay, so what are some words and thoughts or ideas that come to your mind just when you hear the word legacy? And if you have a piece of paper handy and a pen, jot a few down. If not, just kind of keep them in your imagination, and you might share them at the end. So what comes to your mind? We all have associations, memories, stories, ideas about what legacy is. So legacy, a gift by will. I can't actually read this because there's a bar. Interesting. Okay. A gift by will of money or other property is what the dictionary says. So this is the idea that's been planted in our minds that Webster's right and legacy is about our material, what we pass on materially. And what I like to start to think about legacy is, you know, how the ocean rolls up every day with the tide, rolls these beautiful gifts up onto the shore. And that maybe we start to think about that, what in my life, in the experiences of my life, will be left on the shore when I'm not here. So a watery image for us. And then just to kind of say, material matters include all of these things: material possessions, our bank accounts, trusts, the different things. Some of us have some of us don't. And what legally they come to call our estate. And what I want to say about this is that it's such a privilege, actually, and a responsibility to have material, and to also be stewards of the earth, which I'll keep also reiterating is part of our legacy, and that we care for our matter while we're here, our material matters, and that we also pass them on with a lot of good consciousness and care and relationship sharing with our loved ones. And when I think about material matters and the responsibility of leaving something for the next generation, I used to be a beekeeper for 6 years. And I always say we can take a good lesson from a queen bee. And a lot of people don't know this, but when a hive swarms in warm June, usually it's when the hive is thriving. It's when the queen bee actually feels that it's time to pass this thriving hive over to a daughter. And so she lays a daughter cell, or sometimes several, and I will say they do fight to the death, but we won't go there, the daughter cells. But the fact is that she leaves this thriving hive to go and make her way and create another hive. So she takes some of the bees, not all of the bees, less than half, I think, and then she scouts a new home. But this image of leaving the world, the earth, and our loved ones thriving is a big part of how I care for legacy. Okay, so given that, again, I'm just going to ask you again, take a moment. What are words, images, and thoughts that come to your mind when you hear the word legacy? Again, lots of times what's top on our mind, there's something underneath. Just seeing what that might be for you. A mess is what someone said to me as I asked them, as I like to do when I'm preparing for something. So this was years ago. I was preparing a talk on legacy, and this woman, her only words were a mess. And as I talked to her more deeply about this, I realized it had nothing to do with the material possessions. It was a relationship mess in her lineage. And I thought, wow, it's quite something to be willing to share. And then also I started to realize a lot of people had the same answer. So getting curious about legacy led me to kind of categorize, even though I'm not that much into categories, but I found that things land in material matters, they land under meaning matters, which is what we're going to discuss today and inquire into, meaning matters. And then also what I like to call mortality matters, which will also be woven into today's talk as well. And mortality matters is how you're caring consciously for your end of life, how you're actually imagining that, how you might be able to consciously care for that. And that's partly what Living Well, Dying Well is about. So meaning matters of the heart. And ceremony is definitely something that expands and stretches and grows our hearts. So I looked up legacy again because I asked you to answer it twice. And the Webster Dictionary says legacy is something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or from the past. So that's something to consider, that it's something transmitted from an ancestor or from the past. So another question considering your ancestors, do you have an ancestor, a loved one, who in the lineage of your family or a friend, or even in the culture, who left a meaningful impression on you? Does someone come to mind? And just notice even in our bodies, when we think of our loved ones that have gone before us, who've touched us, we might feel warmth, we might feel some sensations of heart. And then to consider, what values, qualities, or actions did these people or this person embody in life? And again, you might write it down, or you just might remember for a moment and notice. And that might embodying these qualities in our own lives be a way of living a part of their legacy. We can't mention the healthy ancestors and the ones who have passed down beautiful gifts without acknowledging, and especially in these times, that we have inherited some challenging legacies. And are there qualities or actions that an ancestor or ancestors embodied and expressed in life that you do not wish to be the lineage bearer of? Is it a good heart question? And then also, what responsibility do we have to these inherited legacies to make change? A hospice counselor, who's the hospice counselor for the hospice counselors here in Victoria, Heather Fox, says, it's a wonderful thing that we can change our own heart. It's a wonderful thing that we can actually change our own heart, that we may have inherited prejudice and different things, and that we have this capacity as humans to change our hearts. It's a great part of our legacy. So one of my longtime mentors, who is an ancestor now, is Angeles Arian. And she taught me that we had a male ancestor that sits on our right side and a female ancestor that sits on our left. And that the ancestors are invested in seeing that current generations and generations to come fulfill their life stream and purpose in good, true, and beautiful ways. And it's been a wonderful thing for me to imagine that. And especially when I'm challenged myself by my own thoughts or my own actions, to imagine that I do have this kind of support. So as Anna said, I'm a life cycle celebrant. That's one of the hats that I wear. And I started to think for this presentation, well, people don't know what life cycle celebrant means. And it means someone who's really invested, actually, and interested in honoring significant transitions in life, thresholds of change, if you will. And these five are five, if we get the privilege and the beauty and the gift of living a long life, that we'll get to embody and experience. So being born, birth. And if we're not from a specific kind of religious organization or belief where they baptize or bless our children, then how are we welcoming our babies into the world? How are we offering a conscious time to actually welcome these little ones? I actually am a new grandmother, 7 months. I'm 7 months grandmother. And yeah, I don't know if my stepson and daughter-in-law will want this, but after COVID, hopefully when things are a little more open, I would love to have, because this little one has many grandparents. So youth is a time where actually in most land-based cultures, or all land-based cultures, there would be rites of passage. There would be ceremony to welcome us into the time of our youth with consciousness and care. As an adult, some of the rites of passage are, we might be married, it might not be our choice. Motherhood or fatherhood might be another choice, which would be like an initiation where a ceremony might be had. Being a step parent, I'm a step parent for 33 years. Being a guardian, being called to be the guardian of a young person, or taking on that role is part of being an adult in the world. Realizing that maybe all the children are our children. Godmothers and godfathers are initiated into a role, an adult role, to exemplify values for our godchildren. And the elder. How do we become good elders? So sometimes retirement puts us into a place where we'll consider ourselves an elder. And lots of times people say to me, I've taught a class on the second half of life, and I started teaching it when I was 39, and they said, oh, you're too young, 39. And I said, well, I'm not sure how long I'm going to live, but it seems like a good halfway mark to me to move into the second half of life. Elders, being a grandparent can be that initiation, and especially being called to be a steward in the community, to volunteer, to show up, again, to have this vision for the next generation as an elder that we deeply care. And then ancestor, which seems a bit lost, I have to say, even the word in our culture here in the West. And I've traveled, I'll share a few photos of ceremonies I've attended in other countries and participated in. And what is the role of ancestors in this cycle? So if you look at these five, I wanted to put them in a circle, but I'm not so good at the computer. And because if your worldview considers that we might be coming back again, and as Pema Chodron, a Buddhist, says, may we come back smarter, is that the ancestor becomes the child again. And so we feel ourselves, when we have this, are curious about this worldview, we might have a sense that ancestors definitely have their place. And how can we have good elders if we don't have a sense of answering to our ancestors? And how can we have good adults if we don't have good elders? So we can go back. How can we have good youth, initiated youth, if we don't have adults who will show up for that? And how do we have good youth if they don't have contact with the younger ones and responsibilities to them? So these are the cycles of ceremony. And not to mystify it, I don't want to mystify ceremony. At the same time, I'd never want the mystery to be lost from ceremony. So I love what Richard Wagamy says. He says, ceremony is whatever brings you closer to your essential self. Ceremony is whatever brings you closer to your essential self. And we want to hope that our essential self runs through all of these: birth, youth, adult. We don't want to lose that essential self. And sometimes when we're experiencing malaise or depression, sometimes we're losing touch with our essential self. This is why ceremony is so important. So Margaret Mead, wise woman, said, when a person is born, we rejoice. I couldn't help but share my new baby grandson. And when they're married, we jubilate. When they're married, we jubilate. But she says, when they die, we try to pretend nothing has happened. So this isn't for everyone. It's not true for everyone, but just to say, it's an experience for many. So what happens in early life influences our experience in the present, and in particular, ceremony. So an example is, I'm sharing some ancestors of mine. On the left is Gertie and Carmen Allport. And actually my great aunt is on the call today. So shout out to my Aunt Burl, they're one of their children. So Gertie and Carmen belonged to the Anglican Church. It was an important part of their life. And when my grandfather died at 69 of a heart attack, there was a full open casket wake for an afternoon and an evening, or an evening and an afternoon. And there was full ceremony in the church, a funeral, and then also a procession to the burial grounds. Now, my grandfather, actually, the truth is, he died in the winter and the grounds were too frozen. And so we had to come back again in the spring to actually do a full burial. And I also remember other ceremonies for folks who had died, especially in that little town, North Gore in Ontario, where when the hearse went by, every car that was anywhere near an intersection stopped and flashed their lights. And so you knew that something had happened. You felt it. The community was acknowledging, we see you. We see you in your loss. So in contrast, so that's my experience in North Gore. My contrast with my other grandparents is they lived on the West Coast. And my grandmother was a medical secretary. My grandfather was a career military officer. Both of them, my grandfather died earlier than my grandmother, but both of them had adamant wishes, no service by request. So I'm going to leave that for a moment, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. Except for to just put the big words up there, no service by request. So for me, when I moved to British Columbia, I realized after about 3 or 4 years that I had not gone to a funeral. And I wondered what was up. I was from the East. When someone died, we went to the funeral. And in the West, I guess I didn't know many people who had that in their worldview and their practices. And even occasionally, if someone's parents died, I said, tell me when the service is. I will come, and in honor of your parents and to support you. And they'd say, oh no, there's no service. So I actually started traveling to various countries. One was Mexico. This is Maria Teresa Valenzuela, and she was a co-facilitator with me. She taught me a lot about the Day of the Dead in Mexico, and also initiated me into the idea that it's never too late to have ceremony. And it's a different story, but I'll just share a short snippet. My granny, so the one on the right in the other picture, had a child who died at 3 months old. There was never a ceremony. In fact, I'm not even sure that they had a cremation or anything in those days. Sometimes the babies were just taken. My grandmother told me about this baby I didn't know just as I was going to Mexico. And Mary Teresa Valenzuela said, I will do a ceremony for who would have been my uncle. And so she took me to an orphan grave in the cemetery and offered a ceremony for me to acknowledge the loss in our family that had never been spoken, at least to me. So influences of other cultures. I've gone back to Bali, I think 4 or 5 times, and I often go to a cremation ceremony. It's welcome there. In fact, sometimes you're the special guest. And I was invited to a high caste priest ceremony where I was actually the invited guest. And so it was an all-day affair from dawn till the end of the day, till sunset. This particular picture is I didn't take any pictures at the high caste priest ceremony, but I took a few at this one. And serendipitously, I missed my grandmother Gertie's ceremony because I was heading to Bali. And I ended up at the cremation ceremony of a woman the exact age as my grandmother, and got to walk in the procession with their family, because they believed that the more the merrier, the more the people that are there to give their loved one a send-off, the better the loved one's journey is, and the more support for their grief. So sometimes we need to leave the familiar to experience what we've lost. When I was there, I felt this visceral experience of longing for the return of some kind of ceremony. And that I really saw how ceremony is personal, familial, and communal, that the community is all welcome, that the family is there, and that the person is well honored. So this is the grandson of the grandmother is riding on top of this. It's kind of like a float, and they process through the village, and people pour out of their doorways and follow them all the way to the cremation grounds. So again, what is ceremony and ritual? Maybe just to demystify it a little bit. Ceremony and ritual include symbols, symbolic gestures, intentions, embodied actions and practices. And in the case of the dead, to deliver us through a liminal space of our initial loss and disorientation, which can be sometimes labeled grief, into a new relationship with our deceased loved one, and a new relationship with our own life. Because when someone close to us dies, something has changed. And I just paused for a moment to say that I liken grief to a labyrinth. So some of you may be familiar with the image of a labyrinth, and it's not a maze. A maze leads to dead ends. but a labyrinth leads in a creative way, enfolding and unfolding, meeting others, being met, pausing, seeing what shows up, to a center place. So ceremony can take us into a center place for sharing our grief with our friends and our family, and then can help us make the journey out. And not just one ceremony. In these cultures, there's many ceremonies when someone dies. So I came back to the West, and I actually, my husband and I had a farm on the Sunshine Coast, and we said we were the equine assisted living for old and wayward horses, because people were leaving their old injured horses with us. And we kind of said yes, a bit naively. And what we didn't realize was that we would be nursing them until their death. And so really we had a horse hospice without knowing it. And after the third one died, our vet said to us, "Your horses have had better send-offs than most people I know," meaning we had had rich ceremony for our horses. Sometimes the ceremonies lasted days as the previous owners showed up to participate, stay overnight even, have meals, and we all participated in burying our horses on our land. So then I started to get curious about coming back to humans and bringing ceremony to humans in my own culture again, and what that might look like. And so I studied funeral celebrancy. I had already done quite a few celebrations of life in my life, because families of clients had invited me to hold space for their families. And then as I was doing more ceremony, I came to meet John Shields. Some of you may know John Shields if you live in Victoria or in British Columbia. He was the leader of the labor union here for many, many years. And prior to that, John was a Catholic priest. And when I met he and his wife, Robin, John had already been diagnosed with amyloidosis. It's a very debilitating and very painful disease, and there's no cure. And John was very conscious about his dying. And he and I and Robin had this lively conversation one night over dinner at their home. And the next day he called and asked, actually Robin called and asked if I would be his celebrant and walk with him through the end of his life. And what so struck me was he gifted me a copy of his book. And in the middle of this book that he had written before he ever was diagnosed, he had asked this question: how will my death affect the future? How will my death affect the future? It's a question. It's a legacy question. And I thank him for that. Gave me pause. And John also felt that his consciousness went on, and he didn't have a lot of fear around death. And another thing he said was that he wanted his body cared for in death as in life. And so his family and I co-created a ceremony for 3 days where we took care of his body, and we vigiled in his backyard. And this is a stretch for many of you, I know, but I felt like I just really wanted to say what's so, and that this is possible. And any part of the stages to this are possible for holding ceremony, in person or not in person, which will hopefully get some time at the end to share about how to have ceremony in COVID, and how to gather, and how also to have personal ceremony. So I was still wondering, why might someone avoid ritual and ceremony when it's such an important part of our lives, or can be, and is a very important part of over, I would say, 85% of the cultures in the world. My teacher, Angeles, was a cross-cultural anthropologist, and she studied all the cultures in the world, as many as possible, to see what were similar, what were similarities, and ceremony is definitely one of them. So I share a brief story of Sid. Sid and I met on the Sunshine Coast. We used to say we don't need Netflix because we have Sid's video store. And so in a time when Netflix and online films were taking over, Sid had this fabulous video store. And right until 2018, she had to sell it when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And when she asked me to walk with her, she said, Penny, I need your help. And she was very practical about the practical end of life things. I need to do the papers. I need to take care of my son in every way possible. He means everything to me, but I don't want any feather waving, drumming, singing, storytelling. I don't want any ceremony. And I was very struck. And I'm like, but Sid, you're asking me. I'm a ceremonialist. And what happened unfolded over, I would say about 6 or 7 months. Our relationship deepened and deepened, and her illness kept progressing and progressing. And by the time it came to Sid's death, I can say that, well, what she said just before she died was, this is the best ceremony I've ever experienced. And we lived ceremony for days and days. But what I realized was that she had never experienced ceremony for the end of life. That was why she didn't want. I asked her if she had participated in a ceremony for someone's death, and she was estranged from her family. And she said no. And so I started to really empathize and understand that not all of us have been exposed to any kind of ceremony. So this idea in the West of no fuss, no funeral, no service. And some of you may have said that to your loved ones. And so, what I might be sharing might be a little challenging, but I'm gonna say it, that not wanting to be a burden can often contribute to a greater burden for mourners. Ceremony is creative. It's not static. It's not rote. It's the creativity of your loved ones coming into action in appreciation and love. So when mourners' hands are tied, this natural, healthy impulse to do something, to honor that something big has happened, gets thwarted. And beauty and the offerings of gratitude and appreciation can be thwarted as well. These are heart matters. It's hard on a heart. So no ceremony by request. And my inquiry has been, what is the long-term legacy of this request? And I do encourage people to question it if it is their request. So ceremony in the time of COVID, let's share. I'm just marking this because I'm close to finishing my slideshow, and I really want to hear from some of you who have had maybe ceremony stopped because of COVID, or you found a creative way to share together during this time. Maybe there's some celebrants on this call too, who I invited to join us, who can share. So just a few more here. Why might ritual and ceremony particularly be important at the end of life? They slow us down. Ceremony slows us down and offers resources and opportunities to meet what I call the betwixt and between time, where our own existential angst, concern for our own mortality, and the deep feelings of grief can be shared in creative ways in community. At that home funeral for John Shields, there were choir directors directing people in song, poets read, musicians came, young people came and played didgeridoo and other instruments, prayers. The neighbor brought firewood. A Guatemalan man kept the fire. There's so much creativity that was allowed and welcomed. And because a ceremonial space had been created, then we can walk together through this liminal space with safety and awareness and coherence. So just a brief something for your imagination, and maybe many of you have done something like this. My mother-in-law died years ago, and there was no ceremony. And a year went by and there was no ceremony. And another year went by and there was no ceremony. And my eldest stepson was grieving the fact that our family had not got together. Pat, my mother-in-law, had 6 children. Every one of them in many ways has a different spiritual belief and different spiritual practice, and no one could agree what to do. And so the decision was made that everyone would do their own thing. And just before Pat died, she was asked what she wanted done with her ashes. Would she like them buried under the tree where her husband, Jack's ashes were? And she was very clear. She said, no, I want my ashes in Maui. I want my ashes in Maui. And we were like, oh, okay. But we wanted to honor her wishes. So our family did take a journey, and it was in 2019, just before COVID. And I'm so grateful that we did. We spent a week in ceremony with Pat. We had this shrine to her. We drank Tim Hortons coffee. We drank red wine. We had pictures of her throughout the stages of her life, favorite flowers. We played Israel. Oh, I'm missing his last name, but he sings What a Wonderful World. We sang that over and over and played it over and over because she loved it. And then on the last day before we were leaving, the day before we were leaving, we went to the Maui coast, this rugged coast where she had given instructions. She knew exactly where she wanted her ashes to be. And we stood on that cliff, and we, a little further down, it was a little safer, and we offered her ashes to the waters. And what I have to tell you is that when we walked back around to leave the site, this labyrinth was there, built by others' hands before us. And we naturally just walked into it. My sons had never walked a labyrinth, but this is ceremony on the ground, there, available for anyone who wants to have ceremony with themselves. And so we did. We walked slowly, everyone just in their own timing. And my daughter-in-law and my son, my stepson, and I were the last left over at the cliff. Everybody Sean had left and John had left and come to the labyrinth. And just as we were going to leave, we looked down, and out of the water, there was this huge shape of something like a shadow. And we were watching like, what is that? And it was rising and rising and rising. And when it rose to the top, it was the hugest mother turtle you've ever seen, poking her head through all the flower petals and all the scatterings. And it was such a beautiful symbol of how nature conspires with us in ceremony. I'm a lover of outdoor ceremony personally. So ceremony changes everything. And that grief shared, this is an old quote, is grief diminished, and not diminished in a way that lessens it, but diminished in a way that spreads it. 50 hearts sharing grief rather than one person holding it alone by themselves is a huge heart to hold, that love and that appreciation and the sadness, sometimes guilt or angst, lots of other emotions. So in ceremony and ritual can return and restore meaning to death and life and deliver us fully into the experience of being human. We're here to grieve. We're here to love. We're here to laugh. We're here to cry. And then I really am curious, is ceremony a biological need, not just a spiritual need, but a biological need? What if ritual and ceremony are bio needs of all fleshy creatures? And if you've ever read White Bone or a few other of the books on elephants and the way they grieve, you might answer yes to this. And as well, here on the West Coast, we all were witness 17 days of J35, the orca whale, mourning her calf. Every day I sat with her, lit a candle, and just, honored the images that were being shared by photographs of her carrying her baby so that the world could see that she was grieving. So through ceremony, the continuity of life can be restored. It's a beautiful image by a local artist who I'm so grateful to share. Chris Johnson, AKA Ice Bear, is from the Ojibwa Nation. Chippewas and Nawash clan. He's here in Vancouver. Apparently, someone gifted me this card, and I love it because it feels like we're walking with each other through the mysteries of life and death. So legacy, material matters, meaning matters, mortality matters, everything matters. And a nice green image of forget-me-nots to consider, what will your legacy be? What will your legacy be? And that living legacy every day could be our practice. A little humor. Snoopy, if for those of you who might not be able to read it, someday we will all die, Snoopy. Charlie Brown says, and Snoopy says, true, but on all the other days, we will not. On all the other days, we will not. Oops, I missed my slide. Oh, okay. So I'm going to end with these words of Joseph Campbell before I just share a little bit about living well, dying well. This quote has walked with me for probably 35, 40 years. He says, people say what we're all seeking is a meaning to life. I think that what we're really seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonance within our innermost being and reality, so that we can actually feel the rapture of being alive. I can attest that being in ceremony is an experience of being alive. And when we can grieve well, we can praise well, as Martin Prichtel says. When we can grieve well, we can praise well, we can laugh well, we can experience the rapture of being alive. Okay, so living well, dying well. What is that? It's a 6-week online class. It started as a 4-week in person, and with COVID, reluctantly, we took it online, and it expanded to 6 weeks. And I have to say, sometimes at the end of 6 weeks, some people say they wish it was more weeks. And because it's an intimate space, it's in real time. We don't tape any of the sessions. We're there together in an inquiry together about all of our end of lives, how to take good care with them. And our course explores the paradox of being human, navigating personal care, relationships, all the documents and legal and medical challenges, opportunities for ceremony and living legacy, with ecological and community awareness, all the while tending the soul's mysterious journey of living well and dying well in these times. So the website is here, and I think Anna will put it in the chat as well if you want to reach out to the Center for Earth and Spirit and hear more or find out when our next class will be, which may be soon, actually. And then just an invitation to be in touch around ceremony, any part of the life cycle. And also, again, the contact for living well, dying well.